Your body is not your own, for you were bought with a price. Surely the passage found in 1 Corinthians 6 was not referring to enslaved people being bought, sold, and bred like livestock. Slaveholders saw themselves as the masters of the Negro body. This ad was placed in the Savannah Republican newspaper in 1859. The slave dealer was a man named Joseph Bryan. 436 men, women, and children were sold for $303,850. The two-day auction would become the largest in history. So slave trading was very lucrative in the United States. But for the enslaved people themselves, to be bought and sold like cattle was an unspeakable horror. We will read excerpts from the book called The Twofold Slavery of the United States that was written in 1854 by English physician Marshall Hall. Hall and his son traveled through the United States, Canada, and Cuba, and he published an account of his experiences and observations about slavery and its effects on Negro families. He writes about the inhumane practice of breeding humans like animals. The slave owners wanted to increase their economic value, and breeding was the solution they came up with. The practice served to prolong the institution of slavery and preserve the notion that black people were not human. They forced intimate contact between male and female slaves. It was not uncommon for slave masters, their friends, and relatives to participate in the process. Hall included reproductions of newspaper advertisements for the sale of slaves and expressed indignation at the separation of husbands and wives and parents from their children. He said, "The states whose names most figure in the advertisements for the sale of slaves in New Orleans are Virginia, North and South Carolina, Kentucky, Georgia, and Missouri. The others are plainly breeding states in the inverse ratio of their increase." He said, "The breeding of the human species is carried on just as that of cattle is carried on." We'll begin reading on page 24. He says the victims of the internal slave trade of the United States are wrested and dragged from their parents' arms and conveyed and sold into Louisiana, Florida, and Mississippi. He then asks, would you know at what age that offspring becomes a marketable commodity? He says, in descending the Cumberland River in Tennessee, an English officer bearing Her Majesty's commission was witness to the sale of a negress. Her price was gradually augmenting when it was announced that she was several months advanced in pregnancy. The biddings then rose at once to a much higher figure. Before the infant is born, it is of money value. But now read the subjoined advertisement cut out of a New Orleans paper for sale. A likely Greif girl, orphan child, 11 months old. He says at 11 months old, an infant is offered in the public prints for sale. Continuing, it says, thus then the breeding of the human species is carried on, just as that of cattle is carried on. The proceeding begins with irreligion and immorality. It proceeds to the eventual separation of parent and child. It leads to the formation and arrangement of those gangs or couples of human beings which pursue their course from state to state, from north to south, and lastly, it leads to public sales of the young of both sexes for every purpose to which they may be applied. In order that this breeding may proceed uninterruptedly, intercourse must be unrestricted. In other words, slave masters needed to remove any sense of guilt or condemnation associated with religion or morals. So it says again, intercourse must be unrestricted. It says holy marriage has no existence among the slave population. Stroud says simply and plainly a slave cannot contract marriage. Taylor affirms as simply and plainly slaves are not entitled to the conditions of matrimony. Can we still see the fruit of this mindset in our community? Yes, it has been detrimental to us. The author goes on to say, in stating that there is no marriage amongst the slaves in the United States, I do not mean that there is never such a ceremony as that of marriage, but that there is no legal and fast bond of marriage, no marriage which the master of the slave may not break and sunder at his convenience, necessity, or will, no holy and indissoluble marriage, no marriage such as will instantly follow the emancipation of the slave and his elevation to the rank of a man, a citizen, and a husband in the sight of God and man. So even though the enslaved people participated in a marriage ceremony, it was not considered a legal transaction because the slave owners could nullify that arrangement at will. It says in Virginia, we heard most complaints of the conduct of the slave servants. They were said to be without any sense of shame and without natural affection towards their offspring, destructive of their clothes and inattentive to their duties. Are not these the natural effects of the slave breeding system? Why is this allowed? The author says because the European planter, infant, boy, youth, and man has been taught that the poor African is a lower race of man, if a man at all, doomed of God to be a servant of servants, not a person, but a chattel or thing, and to estimate his wealth by their numbers. And this is where we have to pause. We were accused of not being fully human, or not humans at all. But we hear crickets about the many reports showing that Europeans are closer to Neanderthals than Africans are. This article from the Daily Mail and many others say that breeding with Neanderthals has long been known to have left its traces in the DNA of modern Europeans. It has long been known, it says. So ancient DNA in humans is due to species interbreeding after man left Africa. So is this not the pot calling the kettle black when Europeans refer to us as not being fully human? Let's go back to the text. It goes on to say, they have been educated to believe the African a doomed or different race of being, fit only for that condition in which, in reality, they have been forcibly held. The author now talks about how the white man sinks under the climate, the toil, the elevated thermometer, the heated atmosphere which surrounds him, and the heated soil under his feet. The exhalations of vapor and miasmata. The colored man, however, his energies may be subdued by them, remains in comparative health. Yet even the latter is sometimes overcome with, shall I call it, languor, or indolence, and then, alas, compulsory measures are perhaps resorted to make him perform his daily task. It is in such a climate that slavery has existed, and existed in all its enormity, under the sunbeams, the overseer, and the lash. These slaves perform all the labor of the South, all the labor required to produce the cotton, the sugar, and the rice of this region. But now it is said that Negroes are lazy. Did that become an established fact after they stopped working for free? Let's go on. It says, it is still a question whether the white man can bear exposure to the sunbeams and the toil requisite to produce cotton, sugar, and rice in large quantity, and at those seasons when the labor required is periodically both most trying in kind and extreme in degree. So that should also prove that the slaves in Egypt were people of the same hue. Continuing, the author says, as slavery is assuredly the dark spot on the United States, the absence of marriage, such marriage as is holy and indissoluble, is the dark spot on slavery. It is a national sin. It is a sin in all that are in any wise partakers in it, in the master more even than in the slave. Let's make sure we understand that fornication and adultery were forced upon them and sanctioned by the Christian church in direct opposition to the Bible in this Christian nation. It goes on to say, it is not possible during such a state of things to avoid the dreadful denunciations of Holy Scripture against it. He, therefore, who deliberately, from whatever motive, sanctions slavery in the United States as it is, as deliberately renounces the religion of Christ. I cannot say less, and more fearful words cannot be written. He says, I have not in this letter deemed it incumbent on me to discuss the question whether the marriage relation can exist amongst slaves or not. Judge J says, a necessary consequence of slavery is the absence of the marriage relation. Thus, slaves live in adultery, and this by and with the consent or order of their masters, who thereby become partakers in their sin. But if the marriage relation do exist, then whom God hath joined let no man put asunder. But the owner of slaves does put the married asunder when he sells the husband or the wife to the north or the south. He says the God of battles has favored the cause and fought the battles of American independence. Will he not favor the good cause of the poor African crying to him for justice too? In what scripture is man stealing and the separation of husband and wife and of parent and child by sale permitted? The author asks. He says, let us be assured that no such iniquity and crime is sanctioned by Scripture. He goes on to say, it is not unusual to hear persons speaking of the providence of God in ordaining that the poor African should be carried into American slavery in order that he may one day carry back American civilization and religion to his barbarous and benighted forefathers. Civilization and religion, he says. What civilization and religion does the poor African slave learn in the heart of the southern states of Georgia, of Alabama, of Louisiana, of Mississippi? It's a great question. If Europeans served as the best role model for what it means to be a civilized Christian, Why are they surprised by the state of affairs in the black community? The promotion of sexual promiscuity has led to a 67% rate of fatherlessness in our community. But now, Americans pretend that they played no part in it. No, it's time to take a look in the mirror, America, and own the fruit that came from the seed you planted in our community. By its own standards, this country has been successful in its attempts to weaken and marginalize the families of the people they enslaved. But who will have the last say? This comes from Jeremiah 30:18-20. Thus says the Most High, Behold, I will bring back the captivity of Jacob's tents, and have mercy on his dwelling places. The city shall be built upon its own mound, and the palace shall remain according to its own plan. Then out of them shall proceed thanksgiving and the voice of those who make merry. I will multiply them, and they shall not diminish. I will also glorify them, and they shall not be small. Their children also shall be as before, and their congregation shall be established before me. And I will punish all who oppress them. You have a judgment coming, America. You are guilty as charged. Thankfully, a day of reckoning is coming, and things that matter most will be restored. If you enjoyed this message, please hit the like, share it, and you are welcome to subscribe. To listen to the message in its entirety, please click the link in the description and join me next time.